People often come up to me and say, "Mr. Owen, you are my role model in every area of my life." To which I reply, "Tell me something I don't know." But then these very real and non-imaginary people keep talking, and they say, "Mr. Owen, I recently learned that you are biracial, that although you grew up in Connecticut, went to boarding school, and have attended not one, but 2 different types of regattas. You are, in fact, not as white as you would appear." Mr. Owen, I aspire to be like you in every capacity. How can I, too, become biracial? Now, the obvious answer to this question is you must invent a time machine so that you can undo the circumstances of your own birth. Normally, this is impossible. But today, like every day in the life of an English teacher, we will laugh in the face of science. Today, I will present to you Mr. Owen's Guide to Being Biracial. Step 1. Become very comfortable with fractions. When people learn that my grandmother, my mom's mom, is from Thailand, one of the first things that usually happens is that the person I'm talking to will put on some variation of their thinking face. And you know what that look means. Oh yes, it's time for some mental math. And so I'll usually wait for a second, I'll let the gears turn a little bit, and then, slowly but surely, the question will come out. "So that means you're a quarter Asian?" Until relatively recently, I didn't think much of this question, but it has started to become weirder and weirder to me. It is hard for me to think about my identity in terms of percentages, to frame my understanding of who I am and where I come from, to be defined by predetermined ratios. Now, I have nothing against fractions in the right context. If you have a pizza, and that pizza is cut into 8 slices, and 2 of the slices are pepperoni, 100%. That pizza is a quarter pepperoni. That's okay. But I'm not sure that it exactly translates when it comes to people and their racial identity. I once lived in a dorm with a student who was half Chinese and another student who was a quarter Chinese. And we joked that between us, we added up to 1 full Asian. Because of math. Now, this is, of course, silly, but this is the logical conclusion of defining someone by fractions. The reasoning gets even more tenuous in my specific case because my mom's parents separated when she was pretty young, so she was really just raised by her Asian mom. If that means that effectively my mom's only parent is Asian, is my mom really 50% white, 50% Asian, half? It seems like there should be some sort of weighted GPA equivalent for her, and by extension me, but that's not really the case. What's more, I found out a few years ago that my kunyai's grandfather was from Tibet, which by itself was surprising and made me feel a little bit better about culturally appropriating some Tibetan prayer flags in my dorm room. But on top of that, she told us that her Tibetan grandfather had moved to Paris to get an engineering degree. While he was in Paris, fell in love with a French woman, and then they moved to Thailand and had my grandmother's father. So my Asian grandma, which of course I only found this out a few years ago because I never asked. It's like, why would I ask this? Side note, my Asian grandma was already herself biracial, so at this point I am not sure how to math myself out. I do not know what the lowest common denominator is, and I'm way, way over my head. People's obsession with arithmetic speaks more generally to the fact that multiracial people can pose some sort of a mystery to other people. Humans like to categorize. We categorize living things into genus and species. We can sort columns into Doric and Ionic and Corinthian. People whose parents are of mixed race challenge the ethnic sorting that governs our world. Just think about any time that you need to fill out demographic data for things like taking a standardized test or DMV-related stuff. For me, this process usually goes like this. Look through the bubble options. There's white, there's Asian. Sometimes I have to choose between the two. Sometimes there's a multiracial bubble, which is a rare and pleasant surprise, although it isn't perfect because it's such a wide umbrella category. Sometimes there's a check all that apply option, which I kind of like because it allows me to be really specific. And then there's the option that carries the most symbolic power, way down at the bottom of the list, the other circle. How many times in my life have I filled in a bubble for other? Do you know the psychological toll that it takes on a person to identify as other? Do you know what else falls under other? Aliens, T-Rexes, rocks. Other. Step 2, become a human version of Google Translate. Even though my kunyai has been in the country since the 1960s, her English is not yet perfect, not for lack of effort. When my mom was younger, and the little spare time that kunyai had between working 2 full-time jobs, she would often read the Thai to English dictionary just to practice. She still has a burning passion for word searches, which I do not understand, but we will still occasionally hook her up with some construction paper books of word searches that we get at the checkout line. But she's still in a spot all these years later where her accent is so thick that people meeting her for the first time usually require subtitles, right? So here's what it sounds like to get a voicemail from my kunyai, okay? You have one new message. Diane. My mom's name is Diana, and I don't know why she named her daughter something that she cannot herself pronounce. Diane, this your mom? It's good. I was really wondering who it was. This your mom. I don't know where you are. Maybe at work or something. I don't know. I make curry with beef. You know, Penang with lamb leap. Maybe Paige come pick it up after work. So my dad teaches at Connecticut College, which is pretty close to my kunyai's apartment. So a lot of times he'll be the designated food picker-upper. And he's such a good sport, trying to figure out the translation of my grandmother's sayings. Okay. And there's always a big pause, and we're still not sure if she's waiting for us to talk back to her, or if she's just thinking, or what. Talk to you later. Love you. Now, obviously the way to get around this roadblock would be to speak with her in Thai instead of English, but that would just be too easy. Kunyai came to this country in the early 60s, which was a very different time for race relations in this country. She arrived at a time when, as she frequently reminds us, you couldn't even get soy sauce in the grocery store. A time when, if she told people that she was from Thailand, they would say, "Oh, you mean Taiwan." She did not mean Taiwan. It was a time when speaking another language would reinforce the fact that you are, returning to my previous point, other. And so when my mom was growing up, they spoke English at home because kunyai wanted my mom to be seen as a normal American, not out of shame, but because she knew that having my mom assimilate meant providing her with the greatest chance of success. And so now we're caught in between these two languages, kunyai with her English, and me without access to my grandmother's native tongue because of her drive to provide a future for her daughter in the midst of racism. Step 3, develop a complicated relationship with racism. The fact that I pass for white allows me a certain degree of power in a society where people continue to make assumptions about character based on appearance. In settings like job interviews or interactions with law enforcement, I can be reasonably sure that my racial identity will not be seen as a threat or a sign of incompetence. Part of me feels weird about this, almost guilty. Each generation that I'm removed from kunyai affords me greater ability to move through this world. When kunyai married my grandfather, 16 states in this country still had anti-miscegenation laws, making it a felony to marry across racial lines. These weren't deemed unconstitutional until 1967 Supreme Court case invalidated laws prohibiting interracial marriage. To think that their marriage would have been illegal in many states in the 1960s is pretty horrifying. But while this is something that's on my mind, it's not a challenge that I come up across in my daily life. I think, too, about the assumptions that people made and continue to make about my grandparents' relationship because of racialized and gendered and classist stereotypes. People assume that a Thai woman who comes to the US with a white military guy is, to be frank, a sex worker, because of the connection between Thailand and sex work is so strong in popular culture. This is not the case for Kunyai, but it's an idea that's inescapable when you're talking about these relationships. One of the first moments that I really remember being aware of my identity as something other than white was in 6th grade when I was reading a book published by The Daily Show. It's basically a satire of a high school civics textbook, and it's really funny. But there's one section where they talk about different countries around the world, and the only thing in there about Thailand is a really, really, really disgustingly graphic joke about sex workers. And for me, this was sort of a wake-up call, especially because this was published by The Daily Show, and they use comedy a lot of times to call out racism. And they still thought that this was an okay thing to say. Step 4, recognize that some questions can't be answered. If you've seen the movie Mean Girls, you remember that scene where they go into the cafeteria and they map out where all the cliques sit by table. There's the jock table, and this table, and that table. And being biracial means that you are sort of always looking around the cafeteria trying to figure out where you're going to sit, if you're going to have a seat at a table. And I think that one of the reasons I enjoy working in high school is because this feeling of not quite fitting in is sort of a perpetual adolescence for me. It is a continual process of trying to figure out who you are, how you identify, and recognizing that your own self-definition tends to not match up with how other people see you. There are times when I'm sitting in class with my 9th graders and I'm questioning my life choices for obvious reasons. But at the end of the day, I think that my life gives me more than enough reason to empathize with people who are still trying to figure themselves out. Thank you.